Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 9. We're going to learn about a point of view and dialogue in fiction. So there are 4 main narrative points of view. There is first person, second person, third person limited, and third person omniscient. So let's break down each one. If someone is writing a story in the first person point of view, it would sound like, I turn on the engine and drive to the end of Mulligan Street. The first person narrators are part of the action. So if you choose to write your story with the I, with the main character telling the story to the reader, okay, it's more intimate, right? With not just, maybe the reader, but the action itself. They are involved in the action directly. Using the I tells us, the readers, much about the characters as they do about the story they are relating. So when you use the I, the reader might get to know that main character a little bit more in relation not just to the story that they are telling, but also how that is affecting the character and how their relationship to those events. According to Sue Miller, who is a novelist, she says that the first person is more propulsive and more immediately seductive to a reader. By that, I think she might mean that it helps move the story along a bit faster. And that when you use the I, the reader gets kind of sucked in a little bit easier, a little faster into the story because you are being sucked into the mind of a character and the voice of a character, and that might make it more immersive. While you may want to draw on personal experience for first-person narration, you're not writing an essay. Don't waste time trying to justify your narrator's behavior. Be sure to change the character to fit the story, not who you feel you actually are. So those who use first person, they tend to draw, the author would tend to draw on their own personal life experiences to inform that character. While that is not always true, I would say beginning writers would do that. I even do that. If I use the I and I'm writing about a character that's not me, generally I do pull from my own life experience in order to form that character. And so just know that if you're going to use I, you might be drawing on your own personal experiences. And if you are, just be sure to be willing to alter the events than how they actually occurred in order to serve the story. Okay. According to Frederick Rakin, who is also a novelist, he says that in crossing the line and having a protagonist act essentially as a stand-in for the author, the reader often winds up being asked to become complicit with whatever the character is involved in. So this is a little bit of a warning. If you use I, and that main character does questionable things like murder or child abuse or anything questionable that the reader themselves may not like or, contradicts with their moral compass, just know that sometimes that reader will shut down and stop trusting that character and be put off by the story. In some ways they will just put the work down. We talked a little bit about Lolita in the last class, I believe, and that also uses a first person narration, and that was obviously off-putting to a lot of readers. But that was an intentional choice. So if you use first person, just know that if they're doing questionable things, that your reader might be put off and they might want to put the story down. But that is up to you. Another popular choice in fiction is third person limited. For example, he gets into the car, turns on the ignition, and drives to the end of Mulligan Street thinking, I will never come this way again. So the third person limited looks over the shoulder and sometimes into the mind of a single character in the story, but it is limited. So it is only from that one character's point of view, or it's limited to that person's scope in the story. It wouldn't jump to other minds or other people in the story. There are 2 types of third person point of view. There is the third person limited, and there is the third person omniscient. Okay. Monica Wood says that the difference is the distance, or from, it works from outside in to inside out. So if you write in a third person omniscient, which is, all the thoughts of all the characters and all the things that could ever happen, it would sound something like Felix looked like a run over squirrel, right? So someone outside the character can see what they look like. The third person limited, however, works from the inside out. Felix felt like a run over squirrel. And in this sense, we know what Felix is feeling. Okay. So third person omniscient, it allows you to see both inside the character and the world around them. This narrative strategy lets the reader make connections before the character can. Okay. So here's my example is Little Red Riding Hood. You all know the story. A lot of fairy tales are told in third person omniscient. Okay. When Little Red Riding Hood goes into the woods and she talks to the wolf, okay, and they have that conversation and then they part ways. The wolf says, "Oh, well, good luck, Little Red Riding Hood. I'll see you later," after Red tells him that, she's going to go see her grandmother. At that point, we know that the wolf is going to the grandmother's house to, sabotage poor Little Red, right? But Little Red Riding Hood doesn't know that. The fact that the reader knows it, and we have like this sense of doom as the reader for the little girl, but that the Little Red Riding Hood doesn't mean that is an omniscient narrator. There is some godlike narrator telling us events that other characters could possibly not know. Okay. So here's an example of third person omniscient. He gets in the car, turns on the ignition, and drives to the end of Mulligan Street, thinking, "I will never come this way again." Standing in the driveway, remembering their first night together at that hotel near Myrtle Beach, she mutters, "Don't come back." Meanwhile, on the other side of town, his new lover is watching American Idol and wondering if he'll remember to stop for burritos on his way over. So note how that went into various points of view, right? We knew it was going into the person who's driving the car. We knew what was going on in the mind of his ex-girlfriend. And then we also know what's going on in the mind of his new boyfriend. Okay. So third person omniscient allows the narrator to enter godlike into the mind and situation of anyone in the story. Okay. Omniscient literally means all knowing. Okay. So you are able to move godlike in and out of a character's thoughts. You can jump back and forth in time and divulge or conceal whatever you please as an omniscient narrator. Just know that with great power comes great responsibility. Okay, so if you're going to choose the third person omniscient, which you don't see very often in literature, but if you do, you might see it most often in children's literature. Okay. Gustav Flaubert says that the artist must be within his work like God within the creation, invisible and all-powerful. We feel him throughout, but we do not see him. And unfortunately, this can sometimes affect their narration because, you have to be very diligent as a writer to make sure that you don't break that spell of the omniscient narrator. If you, switch time and you don't make it clear to the reader that you're switching time, if you switch from one point of view to another, from one character to another, and you don't make that clear, the reader is going to get very confused. So be very careful with third person omniscient. Usually if we get a third person omniscient or one that you might be familiar with, like say, for example, Lemony Snicket books, the narrator themselves is actually a character. Okay, but they are an omniscient narrator that knows all. All right. So just be aware that if you use the omniscient third person, that you have to be very careful to make sure that the reader is oriented in time and place so they don't get confused. You normally don't, though, see third person omniscient in a short story. Not that it can't be done and not that it hasn't been done, but you normally don't see it. You normally see it in a novel. So the two most popular points of view in a story or a short story is definitely first person and third person limited. Okay. Not that the others, again, are off limits, but it's just one that we don't see as often. Now, the second person narration we rarely ever see in short stories. It would sound like you get in the car, turn the engine, and drive to the end of Mulligan Street. Okay, so in a way, you are pulling the reader into the story as almost a character themselves. It's a command form of narrative. You're almost pointing your finger at the reader. All right. Note that this is a rare point of view in a story, and readers tend to find it annoying and they will put the story down. It's also a little gimmicky. A few writers have pulled this off, but since they were kind of like the first to do it, it was interesting when they did it. And then when other writers started doing it, it's like, well, you sound like so and so. Okay. So just know that this is a little jarring. You can do it, but it can fail pretty easily. So I would suggest maybe avoiding second person when you first start writing short stories. But again, it's up to you. Okay, so we're going to move into dialogue now and how characters speak to one another, and also how you punctuate dialogue. It's a little technical, but I've got it broken down in the slides. So go ahead and get out a pen and a piece of paper, and we're going to do a quick activity, okay? Recall a dialogue exchange you have had recently in the past few days. Write it down and be as faithful to what was actually said. Don't leave out any of the boring parts. Pretend you're transcribing a voice recording. Or you can recall a conversation you've had that included future implications or its special meaning just for you, some memory you have. But again, be sure to include every little thing that was said in as faithfully as you can. And so just take about 3 minutes to write that down. When you are done with that activity, I would like you to watch this video. It is linked on Canvas. It's called 4 Simple Rules for Writing Dialogue. This guy kind of breaks down his 4 rules for how dialogue should be written in fiction. It is different than, what is in your memory of an event that has occurred or some dialogue that has occurred. It gives the illusion to the reader that it sounds real, but it doesn't exactly match real world speech. Okay, so I did a little bit of the work for you. The 4 rules are listed on the side of the video. Dialogue is not a conversation. It's not a monologue. It's focused and not forced, and it is interactive. Okay, and he will break down each of these 4 rules for you in the video. Now that you've watched this video, go back to that activity that you worked on before. Rewrite that dialogue exchange, and this time make it concise and dramatically interesting by following his 4 rules. Try fictionalizing the names. That might help. Embellish certain things for dramatic effect. Maybe one character does talk a little bit more. Maybe they say something different. Maybe it gets edited down and maybe their role is a bit shorter. Make it read more like an exchange between 2 characters, an interactive event. If one of the characters is monologuing, right, maybe chop it up and make it more of a power exchange between 2 characters. So go ahead and set a timer for 3 minutes and fictionalize the activity you did previously. All right. There are different types of dialogue or ways that dialogue is relayed to the reader in a type of fiction. There is summary dialogue, indirect dialogue, and direct dialogue. Here is an example of summary. At home in the first few months, he and Maisie had talked brightly about changes that would make the company more profitable and more attractive to a prospective buyer. New cuts, new packaging, new advertising, new incentives to make supermarkets carry the brand. So this is summarized dialogue. It's summarized as part of the narrative, so a good deal of the conversation is condensed. Note that this conversation could have taken an hour, maybe 2 or 3. It would have been pretty boring, right? I really don't care about what's more profitable and attractive to a prospective buyer in their company, right? I really don't want to sit and listen to the new cuts that they have to make and the new packaging and the new advertising. Like, what does this even have to do with, the plot? If you want to relay information like that, things that have taken place in a story, that dialogue did occur, and you want to go into what actually they discussed, summary might be the way to do it. You wouldn't actually give us a play-by-play breakdown of the conversation that they had because, again, it's kind of boring and not necessarily relevant. There's indirect dialogue. Had he brought the coffee? She had been waiting all day long for coffee. They had forgot it when they ordered at the store the first day. Gosh, no, he hadn't. Lord, now he'd have to go back. Yes, he would if it killed him, he thought, though he had everything else. She reminded him it was only because he didn't drink coffee himself. If he did, he would remember it quick enough. Okay, so indirect dialogue is reported in the third person as indirect speech so that it carries, without actual quotation, the feel of the exchange. Someone is almost relaying what was being said, okay, in an exchange. It's almost like the narrator will take over, right, and restate it as if they were restating it to another person, or even in this sense, a little bit more intimate to just their own perception of what happened during that dialogue exchange, right? Note how there's no actual quotation marks, although if you wanted a direct quote like slipped in there because it made, it was such a jarring quote that narrator would remember it, then you could do that. But indirect dialogue is when a character, tells the reader about what was said, not necessarily exactly what was said with quotes. So here's a mix, right, of summary and indirect dialogue. Summary is in yellow, indirect is in purple. Carefully playing down the danger, Len filled her in on the events of the long night. Samantha claimed to be devastated. Note how Samantha didn't say anything, right? If she claimed to be devastated, it would have to be in Samantha's voice with quotes. Oh my God, I was so devastated. And then we go into this whole long diatribe or whatever of how somebody would relay through speech they were devastated. So this is a summary. Then it switches to indirect dialogue. It was all very well if the Siversons wanted to let their cats run loose, but she certainly wasn't responsible for Lisbeth's parakeets, now was she? Okay, so note how the summary shows us that she's devastated. Okay, well, what actually took place? Well, we don't really get into the dialogue of the cats and the parakeets and all of this stuff, right? But it's restated through the lens or the point of view of another character in indirect dialogue. So summary and indirect speech is used to get the reader to the core of a scene, or when, for example, one character has to inform the other of events that the reader already knows, or when the emotional impact has become tedious. Okay, so these are setups, right, for scenes. They're setups for when you want to start including dialogue. How do you set the stage for the reader of when something takes place? In this case, the author used summary, dialogue, summary, and then indirect, and then they'd slip right into actual dialogue, and it puts the reader in time and place. Dramatic events require direct dialogue, however. Okay, so when a change is occurring, when a character has to change, when they are forced to be in a kind of conflict, I would argue that would be a dramatic event. In that case, if that a dramatic event involves another character that they talk to one another, it should be in quotations. In that way, the reader gets to kind of spy on them or see what exactly was said, and it plays out in real time. Okay? So this summary is telling, not showing. They whispered to each other all night long, and as he told her all about his past, she began to realize that she was falling in love with him. Note that this is a very dramatic event. This is something very substantial and significant in this character's life, and it has been summarized. Boring. Nobody likes that, right? We want to see this happen. This is, she'd been falling in love with him. When somebody's falling in love with someone, that is a big event. It seems to be something very important in this character's life, and therefore, we need to see it as the reader. We want to experience this. We don't want it just told to us in summary. So here's an example of the same thing told in direct dialogue. But I thought you hardly knew her, Mr. Morning. He picked up the pencil and began to doodle on a notebook page. Did I tell you that? Yes, you did. It's true. I didn't know her well. What is it you're after then? Who is this person you're investigating? I would like to know that too. So direct dialogue, when the exchange contains the possibility of decision and therefore dramatic action, it's usually presented in direct quotations. So let's put it all together. Summary, indirect, and direct. They differed on the issue of the holiday and couldn't seem to find a common ground. She had an idea. Why not some Caribbean island over Christmas? Well, but his mother expected them for turkey. Oh, Lord, yes, I wouldn't want to go without a Yuletide gizzard. Activity. Go ahead and set a timer for about 3 minutes. Go to your previous first activity where you first wrote dialogue as faithfully as you could. Then you revised it for dramatic effect based on those 4 guidelines. Now add some stage directions with summary. Set up that scene with a little bit of summary so that you can place the reader in time and place, and maybe even the people that where this exchange is about to happen. You could add some backstory or exposition with summary and even some indirect dialogue to lead us into the dialogue. Then add dialogue tags to the quotations to reveal who is speaking and when. So go ahead and set up a timer for 3 minutes and revise that exchange between those 2 people that you have revised for dramatic effect to include these 3 elements. Okay. Characterizing dialogue. Note that what somebody says a lot about them. Not just that, but it's how it is said. The voice of the character also kind of colors the character. Okay? So while I read this, is from Kurt Vonnegut's God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater. Ask yourself, what kind of person is this? I had a female cousin one time, a Rockefeller, as it happened, said the senator, and she confessed to me that she spent the 15th, 16th, and 17th years of her life saying nothing but, no thank you, which is all very well for a girl of that age and station, but would have been a damned unattractive trait in a male Rockefeller. Now ask yourself, who would say something like this? Well, one, it's a senator, but they're also pretty stuffy and quite sexist, right? They're focusing on this gender divide specifically and in a very hoity-toity kind of voice, right? So in this way, we probably don't like this character, right? They might be a villain or just an annoying person that the main character has to tolerate. Here is another exchange or another piece of dialogue that helps color the character. It's from Ernest Gaines' A Lesson Before Dying. Notice the dialect and how that affects, what we think of in our heads of this person saying these things. You think you the only one who ever felt this way, he asked. You think I never felt this way. You think she never felt this way. Every last one of them back there one time in their life wanted to give up. She want to give up now. You know that? You got any idea how sick she is? Soon after he goes, she's going to. I won't give her another year. I want her to believe he'll be up there waiting for her, and you can help me do it. And you the only one. So in this exchange, the character has a regional dialect. Okay? Be careful with these. You make sure that if you don't understand the dialect very well, or if you haven't heard it very often, it can come out as kind of a character, or, it reveals a kind of prejudice. So maybe, be careful with these. Note how not every single sentence included the dialect, okay, with the pronoun. That could also be because if you do it too much, the reader gets really bogged down. They get kind of tired. So if you're going to put an accent or something like that, just put it intermittently, and then the reader will read it with the, all the lines will be read in that voice that you've created. Only it won't be hard to read. Here is another example of dialogue. Coloring a character. In this example, notice the tone. It's not the dialect, but the tone of the character. The knight looked surprised at the question. What does it matter where my body happens to be? He said. My mind goes on working all the same. In fact, the more head downward I am, the more I keep inventing new things. Now, the cleverest thing of that sort that I ever did, he went on after a pause, was inventing a new pudding during the meat course. Okay, so this is from Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass. Note how this character, kind of like the senator, is a high elevated language, right? But it's almost playful because of the things that they're talking about. You can set a scene with dialogue. Here's an example from Joy Williams's Woods. We didn't know no one was here. We thought hit a summer camp all closed up. Curtains all closed up. Nothing here. No cars or gear nor nothing. Looks closed to me. Don't hit to you, JJ. Okay, so this has dialect in it. This has a very choppy speech, so it has tone, and it sets us up for a scene where it's summer and it's a camp, and the curtains are all closed up. So we're thinking, okay, maybe this is a robbery, right? You could set the mood with dialogue. I have a lousy trip to Philadelphia. Lousy flight back. I watch my own plane blow a tire on closed circuit TV. I go to my office. I find Susie in tears because Warren's camped in her one-room apartment. I come home and I find my wife hasn't gotten dressed in 2 days. Okay, this is from Joan Didion's The Book of Common Prayer. So clearly, this character is exhausted. They're tired and they're in a complaining mood, right? You can reveal a theme through dialogue. You feel trapped, don't you? Jane looks at her. Don't you? No. Okay. You just have a headache. I do. Millie waits a moment and then clears her throat and says, for a while thereafter, Wally and I were married. I thought maybe I'd made a mistake. I remember realizing that I didn't like the way he laughed. I mean, let's face it, Wally laughs like a hyena. Okay. So what's the theme here? What the characters talk about is what the story is about. So clearly the story might have something to do with a relationship and someone trying to figure out, what they're willing to tolerate and what they're not willing to tolerate. Okay. You can reveal the past through dialogue. So while I read this, think, what happened in the past as this person has a conversation? What kind of person is the speaker? What is the mood and scene and theme? Okay. And this is from Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. The onlyest time I'd be happy seemed like was when I was in the picture show. Every time I went. I'd go early before the show started. They'd cut off the lights and everything be black. Then the screen would light up and I'd move right on in them pictures. White men taking such good care of they women, and they all dressed up in big clean houses with bathtubs right in the same room with the toilet. Them pictures gave me a lot of pleasure, but it made coming home hard and looking at Charlie hard. I don't know. Okay. So note how it does all of those things at once. It's almost melancholy. It's a happy yet sad memory at the same time. We are, kind of sad as we read it, kind of confused and, who's Charlie? Right. And this is something from the past that the character is, bringing back. Also, it's got some dialect in there. It's also setting the scene, right? Maybe a time and a place, dealing with class and racial divisions. You can have dialogue as action. The surgeon will speak to you, says the radiologist. Are you finding something? The surgeon will speak to you, the radiologist says again. There seems to be something there, but the surgeon will talk to you about it. My uncle once had something on his kidney, says the mother. So they removed the kidney and it turned out something was benign. The radiologist smiles a broad, ominous smile. That's always the way it is, he says. You don't know exactly what it is until it's in the bucket. In the bucket, the mother repeats. That's doctor talk, the radiologist says. It's very appealing, says the mother. It's a very appealing way to talk. Okay. So how does the telling of this memory change the relationship between the teller and the listener? How does this exchange advance the action? Okay. So if we look at it again, we can see that there is a woman and she is at the table. Maybe some, a radiologist is beyond the other side of the table or the desk and, looking at the results of some test that has been done on her body, right? And she wants to know, right? She wants to know what that radiologist is seeing on the screen, but the radiologist refuses to give that information up. Like if she had cancer, he can see it, right? He's looking at the screen, looking at it. He can see that cancer. She's asking, but he will not tell her. Okay. As we move through the scene, he starts, he says something like, well, that's always the way it is. You don't know exactly what it is until it's in the bucket. So suddenly he reveals that, they throw it in a bucket, like whatever they've cut off a person, right? And sometimes you just don't know. And in a way, this actually helps the mother, right? It's like, okay, well, maybe this radiologist wouldn't talk that way to somebody who was maybe dying of stage 4 cancer, right? So it's moving the action along, because now we could probably say, okay, well, maybe the next scene will be her with the surgeon. And we actually get to know what's going to happen. So if in doubt, ask yourself, can this conversation between my characters really change anything? Dialogue is action when it contains the possibility of change. So you don't want to just have dialogue to move a character from one place to the other, right? That would be maybe you would use summary for, okay? You want to use dialogue to show action and that the character is going to change, or that there is a possibility of change for the character. Here's an example of dialogue where there is no possibility of change for the character. This has been the traditional fishing spot of the river people for 1,000 years, and we have a moral responsibility to aid them in preserving their way of life. If you put in these rigs, it may undermine the ecosystem and destroy the aquifer of the entire county. Join the real world, Sybil. Free enterprise is based on this kind of technological process, and without it, we would endanger the economic base. So clearly there is a conflict here. One person has a point of view of what to do with the fishing spot, and the other person has a completely different point of view. But no one is changing, right? They're just staying in their space, and neither are willing to budge. Here's another exchange, which is actually kind of rewritten from the previous one, and it does show action and that there is, a possibility of change. If you sink that drill tomorrow morning, I'll be gone by noon. Sybil, I have no choice. All right. So in this exchange, there is potential for change. There is potential for change, right? Sybil is clearly in a relationship with whoever this person is, and they say, well, they're going to leave if they mess up the ecosystem of that fishing hole. Whereas the other person is conflicted because it's part of their job. They have no choice. It's not that they don't necessarily want to do it, and they don't clearly want their friend or their lover or whatever to be gone by noon, but they're put in this situation where they have to choose, right? And in that sense, it's clearly, it's necessary for us to see them say it in real time. There's another element to dialogue that's not so direct, okay? It's called subtext. It's something below the surface where the characters may not be saying it directly outward, so it's obvious. But what they're saying is, what they mean is kind of embedded underneath by what they say. So here's an example. In this exchange, the daughter of a doctor who performed illegal abortions up until his recent death takes a call. Okay. A woman on the phone wants to speak to the doctor. I'm sorry, he's dead. Dr. Strachan, have I got the right doctor? Yes, but I'm sorry, he's dead. Is there anyone? Does he by any chance have a partner I could talk to? Is there anybody else there? No partner. Could you give me any other number I could call? Isn't there some other doctor that can? No, I haven't any number. There isn't anybody that I know of. You must know what this is about. It's very crucial. There are very special circumstances. I'm sorry. Okay. So in this exchange, right, the daughter picks up the phone, and her dad, who had just died, was performing illegal abortion. So people are calling his phone still, not knowing that he is dead, seeking an abortion. Now, she says, I'm sorry, he's dead. And then the other person on the line clearly wants something from that doctor, but is not exactly, I wouldn't say sad, but they're not being, remorseful that someone has just died, right? Because they clearly have needs beyond that, right? Beyond that person who's just died. So in this exchange, you can see that, the daughter wants to say, look, the person is dead, and I don't know of anyone who can perform this surgery for you. And note that the other woman doesn't even mention the word abortion. She just says, it's very crucial. She's saying it's a special circumstance, right? But and then the person on the other line, the daughter isn't trying to help that other person. Right. So just note that they are not saying the word illegal abortion. They're not even saying the word abortion, but it's clear what they're talking about. And it's clear what each of their motives are in this dialogue exchange. So Hemingway had a theory about subtext. He says if a writer of prose knows enough of what he's writing about, he may omit things that he knows, and the reader, if the writer is writing truly enough, will have a feeling of those things as strongly as though the reader had stated them. The dignity of movement of an iceberg is due to only 1/8 of it being above water. A writer who omits things because he does not know them only makes hollow places in his writing. So what Ernest Hemingway is talking about is pretty relevant in the exchange previously, right? There is subtext here. They are talking about, making an appointment and looking for a doctor, right? And one person's saying that the other doctor is dead. Right? That's the tip of the iceberg, but there's so much drama going on beneath the surface, right? What's going on in the special circumstance of that woman on the other line? Excuse me. How is she, coping with things? I mean, she must be desperate, right? There's all sorts of things going on below the surface that don't make its way literally into the dialogue, but is stated nonetheless. So let's do an activity for text and subtext. Envision a husband and a wife of any other kind of romantic pair, perhaps out on an anniversary dinner or in a car on the other way to pick up little Billy. Give them names and think about who they are. One of these characters suspects the other of being unfaithful in some way. And let's say the other character is in some way guilty. Write a dialogue exchange between these two, where the sore topic is never discussed or referred to directly, because remember, little Billy, might be in the back seat, but instead simmers beneath the words spoken. Don't enter the thoughts of either character. Okay. So go ahead, set a timer for 3 minutes and try to have this exchange, right? Without outright saying, you're having an affair, right? Make it below the surface, right? So have them talk maybe about something else or around the topic, but not directly on the topic, yet everyone will kind of know what they're talking about. So set a timer for 3 minutes and give it a shot. Okay. So there's another method for creative dialogue, and it's called no dialogue. All right. It provides exposition. This story provides the exposition on the beginning of a relationship. It conveys affection and conflict within an old man between love and loyalty. But the boy tries to persuade. Okay. So no matter what the boy says, the reaction is going to be no. But after every no, we get to know a little bit more about these characters. Just, while I read, pay attention to the shift of power back and forth. Can I go out and get sardines for you tomorrow? No. Go and play baseball. I can still row, and Rolio will throw the net. I would like to go. If I cannot fish with you, I would like to serve in some way. You brought me a beer, the old man said. You're already a man. How old was I when you first took me in a boat? 5, and you were nearly killed when I brought the fish in too green, and you nearly tore the boat to pieces. Can you remember? I can remember the tail slapping and banging and the thwart breaking and the noise of the clubbing. I can remember you throwing me into the bow where the wet coiled lines were and feeling the whole and feeling the whole boat shiver and the noise of you clubbing him like a chopping down a tree and the sweet blood smell all over me. Can you really remember that, or did I just tell you? I remember everything from when we were first together. The old man looked at him with his sunburned, confident, loving eyes. If you were my boy, I'd take you and gamble, he said, but you are your father's and mother's, and you are in a lucky boat. Okay. So the dialogue represents a constant shift of power back and forth. The kid really wants to go in that boat and go fishing, but the guy won't let him. Okay. And with every no, more is revealed in the story and the relationship between this old man and the boy. Now we're going to move into punctuation. Okay. How do you punctuate dialogue in a story? So here's an example of an exchange. She stood with her hand on the doorknob and watched him sit on the couch, stuffing Cheetos in his mouth. What a slob. I'm going to the store, she said. You're going to the store, he asked, staring at the television, flipping from channel to channel. Yes. She grabbed a purse from the table. Well, I guess you don't want me to go, he said as he set the TV remote on the coffee table. He leaned his head back, tilted the bag up, and stood the last neon orange bits of Cheetos into his mouth. You got that right, pig. But, he stammered, you told me you like it when I go to the store with you. Not really, she opened the front door. You're kind of a pain. Fine, he sat back on the couch. I'll just watch the end of Game of Thrones. She walked out, slammed the door, and zipped up her jacket. Binge watching Cheetos, slobbering loser. Okay, so let's break down the punctuation of this dialogue exchange. All right. Note that there is a brief setup for the scene that orients the reader in time, place, and mood. It's in the third person omniscient. She stood with her hand on the doorknob and watched him sit on the couch, stuffing Cheetos in his mouth. What a slob. This is a free, indirect dialogue narration that reveals the character's inner dialogue or consciousness. Okay? The what a slob phrase. It's in the voice, but it maintains the third person perspective. Okay? So she says what a slob in her head, but not out loud. Okay? It's still from her point of view, though. But it's not in quotes because she doesn't say it out loud. So here, when she says, I'm going to the store, note that the comma comes before the quotation marks. There's a space, and then it says, she said. That's what we call a dialogue tag. She said. You're going to the store, he asked, staring at the television, flipping from channel to channel. Period. Right? So that's the end of his exchange. This is a complete sentence. Then she says, yes. She grabbed her purse from the table. Note how in the previous line, the he pronoun is not capitalized. That's because it's not, you're going to the store. It's not like a very direct line, right? It implies that perhaps he's going to get an answer. Whereas here, yes, she's being very curt. Okay, and there's no dialogue tag, and the lack of dialogue tag is indicating that she's being very terse. Okay, so if you add a dialogue tag like she said or he said, make sure that you have a comma or another piece of punctuation like a question mark that is implying that the dialogue will return from the other person. Whereas if you don't have a dialogue tag and you want to imply that maybe there's a terse statement, you just leave it out and just put a period at the end of the dialogue. So attribution to a line of dialogue tells the reader who is speaking. You don't always have to have it, right? As long as it's clear who's speaking. You'll notice that authors will drop the dialogue tag, right? Readers generally won't even read it, after they know who's speaking. They'll only need it for cues, as if, maybe the dialogue has gone on so long that they forgot whose line it was, right? So in that case, you would put the dialogue tag back in. So this breaks down the dialogue punctuation a little bit more. Again, notice that the she is lowercase. The one below where the she is uppercase, it's separate from the action. It's not part of the dialogue. She grabbed her purse is not a dialogue tag. Okay, it's not there to tell us who spoke. It's just to show action. So when you start dialogue from a new person, right? So each person gets their own paragraph. When another person speaks, they get a new paragraph. Okay, so every time a new character starts to speak, when it's their turn, put a tab, right, in your Word document to show that a new person is speaking. I guess you don't want me to go, he said, right? Then it goes to her. You've got that right. Note how it doesn't even fill the whole line on the page, right? But it's still indented. Then it's indented again. But there's the tag. Also, you can inject a movement in characters in between dialogue, and it creates a kind of pause, right? Leaves the reader kind of in a suspended state. Here, the author put he stammered, right, in between but and you told, because he's stammering in between what he's saying. So it's kind of illustrating how he's saying something. If you do that, just put commas, right? But, comma, he stammered, comma, you told me. Okay. Here's another tricky element. Make sure that you do one thing at a time, or that the character does one thing at a time. Try not to make them do two things at once. You want to make sure that the reader can see what's going on. Okay, that they don't get confused as to what movement is happening. In real life, things happen at the same time. Okay, that is a thing that happens all the time. Events are all happening at the same time. But when we write about it in fiction, it doesn't have the same effect when we try to describe it as such. Okay, so in fiction, you need to give the reader enough cues so they can illustrate that movie in their head. To do that and not confuse them, just to make sure that when you describe movement, that you give one movement at a time. For those of you who like action, books that describe a lot of action, like, right now I'm reading the Witcher series again, and there's a lot of sword fighting, and it's real. Game of Thrones does this too. Lots of sword fighting and movement and action, right? If you pull out one of those scenes, look at what is happening one after another. Note that the writer is not trying to make it seem like it, the writer gives the illusion that all these things are happening at once and very quickly. But when you look at their descriptions, they do focus on one thing at a time in progressive order. It just gives the illusion that it's sped up in the reader's mind. Okay? So to move the action forward, put events in order, one thing at a time. Here it says she walked out, slammed the door, and zipped up her jacket. Okay? The first thing she did was she walked out. Then she slammed the door. Then she zipped her jacket. Okay? But we see it very successively and very quickly. If you tried to do this all at once, it might confuse the reader, right? She slammed the door as she walked out, zipping up her jacket. The reader's like, wait, what happened first? It's confusing, right? It's okay to just put things in order. It will speed up in the reader's mind. Okay, economy and dialogue. You don't want to say every little thing, right? You want to make sure that maybe that your dialogue does more than one thing at a time. Okay. You don't want to simply copy what you heard on the street. You want to make it sound natural. But that doesn't mean it is natural. It takes careful editing to create natural sounding dialogue. Generally, that means keeping things brief and paying attention to the rhythm of the sentences. Sentences are short. They're not particularly grammatically correct, but rather quirky and characteristic of the speaker. Okay? Because direct dialogue has a dual nature, emotion within a logical structure, its purpose as fiction is never merely to convey just information. It must simultaneously characterize, provide exposition, set the scene, advance the action, foreshadow, and/or remind. You might not be doing all of those things in an exchange, but it shouldn't just do one thing. It shouldn't just give some information, right? It should do multiple things at once. So unlike description, where you're showing how a reader is how a character is moving, right? In dialogue, you are trying to kind of set up you're juggling multiple things at the same time. So fiction shapes reality into something readable. So when you're reading, it seems real in the reader's head, but it's not how it would play out in the real world. Okay? If you try to transcribe something exactly as it happened in the real world, it would get really boring to the reader really, really fast. It would start to annoy them and bog the story down. So, in dialogue, phrases like or erg or do not have the same effect in scenes like they do in real life. So people like to put them in there, like beginning writers will, because they were thinking. It doesn't have the same effect. Like you think it does because it does in real life, but it actually doesn't when it's in fiction. Okay, so just avoid empty noises in speech so that the reader can, live through that scene and see it play out. Here's another tip. If your character is distracted or preoccupied in thought, adding an ellipses can reveal a dramatic realization or character development. I just didn't realize ... Right? Like it kind of just hangs suspended there and you know that they're thinking about what they didn't realize. Characters can cut each other off. I just didn't know. Dash. You know nothing, Jon Snow. Okay, now you guys know I like Game of Thrones. I read those books too. Right. So you can cut them off. Don't do it too often again, but you can definitely do that. Characters can change their minds. I needed it for my project, he said. Oh, that's shifty. That's a good piece of dialogue. Already you could tell that there's some conflict there. Someone's lying. Tip 5, this one comes from Stephen King. Okay, he has this thing about adverbs that he doesn't like. I insist, this is coming from him, I insist that you use the adverb and dialogue attribution only in the rarest and most special occasions, and not even then if you can avoid it. Well, what is an adverb? An adverb is an adjective that usually ends with ly, and it kind of adds flavor to what's being done. It's add flavor to a verb, okay? Stephen King hates them. He just wants a regular old dialogue tag that says he said, she said. For example, put it down, she shouted. Give it back, he pleaded. It's mine. Don't be such a fool, Jekyll, Utterson said. Okay, so in these sentences, shouted, pleaded, and said are verbs of dialogue attribution. Put it down, she said menacingly. Give it back, he pleaded objectedly. It's mine. Don't be such a fool, Jekyll, Utterson said contemptuously. The 3 latter sentences are all weaker than the 3 former ones, and most readers will see why immediately. So just comparing these two, you can tell that the one in blue is way easier to read than the one in red. The one in red, it tells more than it shows. The dialogue itself already knows that we already know based on what people were saying that they were shouting and that it was menacing and that things are happening objectively and contemptuously, right? Without having to say it. Okay. I would even argue that shouted and pleaded are going too far. Put it down with an exclamation mark. Clearly she's shouting. Give it back, he pleaded, it's mine. Just say, give it back, it's mine. We know he's pleading. So we don't actually need to say that. You just say he said. Okay. So Stephen King says, well, to write adverbs is human. To write he said, she said is divine. So when in doubt, don't try to add too much to your dialogue tags to make it seem more real to the reader. Just say he said, she said, and let the dialogue come out the way it's supposed to, let it color the characters and how they're speaking. If you have an exclamation point, you don't have to say that they shouted because clearly they're shouting, right? All right, so that's week 9. It's a lot of technical stuff, but you can use the slides to help you punctuate your dialogue correctly, right? Just with the extra tabs and the commas and the dialogue tags and things like that.